The burden of time in the Grand Bazaar. Standing in the dim corridors of the Grand Bazaar, I watched the world around me. The dust motes suspended in the air seemed to whisper the story of those small silver oxys, now gleaming in the hands of tourists, but once circulating through the veins of an empire. These pieces of metal, clinking lightly on the merchant's scales, were not merely tools of trade. They were the silent witnesses to the Ottoman Empire's magnificent rise and its bitter fall. As a time traveler, I knew that each one carried an invisible burden of history. How they became the economic lifeblood of an empire, and later, transformed into a poison slowly released into circulation. Foreign silver in the empire's veins. The 16th century witnessed a radical transformation in the world economy. As Spanish ships carried tons of precious metal from the silver mines of Potosi to Europe, the continent's economic balances were upended. This flood of silver gave birth to the economic phenomenon known as inflation, and prices rose by 400% over the course of the century. The Ottoman Empire could not remain outside this global wave. However, the real shock came with the Age of Discovery. The Portuguese had succeeded in rounding the Cape of Good Hope to reach India directly, causing the spice and silk trade, which had flowed through the Mediterranean for 1,000 years, to shift to new routes. As the ports of Venice and Genoa fell silent, Lisbon and Amsterdam were on the rise. The Ottoman Empire's position as a strategic bridge was losing its meaning, and traditional transit taxes were dwindling. While this global transformation was unfolding, the palace in Istanbul continued to construct magnificent buildings and expand the state bureaucracy. Towards the end of the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, state expenditures began to multiply far beyond revenues. Monumental projects like the Suleymaniye complex placed a heavy burden on the treasury. As conquest slowed, income from war booty, the economic engine the empire had relied upon for so long, dried up. The Ottoman Empire was like a cyclist trying to balance without pedaling. It could stay upright while in motion, but once it stopped, a fall was inevitable. The decay of money and social unraveling. The practice of lowering the currency's value, known as tashish, debasement, was not just a technical move to fix the state's finances. It was a trauma that deeply affected the social fabric. As the janissaries were paid in low-grade oxys, they reacted by creating inflation, artificially raising prices. However, those most affected were the common people. Artisans could not buy raw materials with the worthless coins in their hands, and producers could not find fair value for their labor. The fixed salaries of civil servants eroded a little more with each new minting of money. An interesting dual economy emerged. On one side, the worthless axes the state minted and tried to force into circulation. On the other, the foreign currencies and precious metals preferred by merchants and money changers. Shopping in the Grand Bazaar had turned into a test of trust. Sellers would check the coins customers brought by biting them, ringing them, or weighing them on special scales. This was not just a test of the money's purity, but an effort to gauge the trustworthiness of the person standing opposite them. As the value of money fell, trust between people eroded, and ultimately, faith in the state was shaken. Reform efforts and structural blockage. In the 17th century, while mercantilism, an economic concept where national wealth was measured by gold and silver stocks and exports were encouraged, was rising in Europe. There were some attempts at reform in the Ottoman Empire. Sultan Murad IV and the Köprülü viziers tried to ensure budget discipline and curb luxury consumption. However, these measures were far from solving the structural problems. The Timar system, lands granted to cavalrymen, sipahis, in exchange for service, had corrupted, and the central treasury had lost this vital source of revenue. The productivity of the land fell, and agricultural production decreased. The state raised taxes to cover increasing costs, which led peasants to abandon the land, creating a vicious cycle. By the time the 19th century arrived and the Industrial Revolution began in Europe, the Ottoman artisan had become unable to compete. British textile factories, mass-producing with steam engines, established a crushing superiority over Ottoman handlooms based on the guild system. The 1838 Treaty of Balta Liman, which granted low customs duties to foreign goods, made this competition even more unfair. Unemployment rose in the cities. The traditional economic structure collapsed, and this fueled political instability. An empire in the swamp of debt. The Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, represented a threshold of no return for the Ottoman Empire in economic terms. Entering the war as an ally of Britain and France, the empire spent heavily on modern weapons and logistics. The first foreign loan taken after the war, £3 million sterling, seemed like a savior on the surface, but was actually the beginning of captivity. The most tragic aspect of the borrowing was that these resources were not converted into productive investments. Most of the money went to paying the interest on old debts or to the palace's luxury expenditures. Sultan Abdulaziz's magnificent European tour in 1867 and the construction of the Dolmabahce and Turan palaces were financed by these debts. Each new loan came with higher interest rates, and the debt spiral grew. By 1875, the Ottoman external debt had reached £200 million sterling, an astronomical figure for that era. The state was forced to announce that it could not even pay the interest on its debts. This declaration of a moratorium mobilized the creditor, European states. Duyunu Umumiye. The destruction of sovereignty. The Public Debt Administration, Duyunu Umumiye, established in 1881, was the official document certifying the de facto end of Ottoman economic sovereignty. Composed of representatives from 7 countries, Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Italy, the Netherlands, and the Ottoman Empire, this institution did not just collect taxes. It secured full control over strategic products such as tobacco, salt, silk, fisheries, and alcoholic spirits. The institution's magnificent building in Istanbul, the structure built in Galata that still stands today, carried symbolic meaning. Ottoman citizens paid the value produced on their own soil first to the representatives of foreign creditors, while the remainder could barely cover the state's minimum needs. This situation was not only an economic domination, but a psychological one. Every tax payment was a reaffirmation of the loss of independence. The Public Debt Administration had over 5,000 employees and possessed a more effective and organized structure than the Ottoman Ministry of Finance. The empire's economic decisions were no longer made in Istanbul, but in London, Paris, and Berlin. Historical economic lessons. Looking back today, the lessons to be drawn from the Ottoman economic collapse remain valid for modern states. Growth not based on production is unsustainable. An economy fed by conquest and booty is doomed to collapse when the revenue stream from war stops. True wealth comes from increased productivity, not territorial expansion. Monetary stability is the foundation of the social contract. Protecting the value of money is not just an economic responsibility, but a political one. Inflation not only erodes purchasing power, but destroys the fabric of trust in society. Debt is not an alternative to structural reforms. Borrowing should be used to buy time for reform, not to solve problems. Reforms postponed by debt lead to greater crises. Economic independence is essential for political sovereignty. The example of the Public Debt Administration shows that losing economic control effectively means losing political independence. External control over a state's budget is the end of that state's sovereignty. Adaptation to changing global conditions is vital. The Ottoman Empire failed to correctly read global transformations like the Age of Discovery and the Industrial Revolution, and could not update its economic model in time. History shows that systems that adapt, rather than those that resist change, survive. Before pressing the button on the time machine, I took one last look at the labyrinthine corridors of the Grand Bazaar. Tourists were buying silver Akçe replicas as souvenirs and taking selfies. Those pieces of metal were now merely museum objects, but the lessons they carried were still alive. An economy is not just about numbers, budgets, and trade balances. At its foundation lies a social contract built on trust, stability, productivity, and justice. The Ottoman Empire collapsed not because it failed to protect this contract, but because it could not create a new contract to adapt to the changing conditions of the time. The empire became historical proof that no structure without sound economic foundations can remain standing. This lesson sheds light not only on the past, but on the present and the future. The rise and fall of civilizations is ultimately a reflection of economic choices and the value systems behind those choices.